All right, welcome. We are so glad that you're here today. My name is Erin Lane. I am the Director of Making Research Matter with the Religion and Social Change Lab, which just really means my job is to translate our research findings into, as the people say, news you can use. But in addition to this role, I'm also a trained vocational facilitator, which means I care religiously about how we create spaces that are hospitable to human wholeness and are hospitable to the holy. So before we jump into the content, I want to take just a few minutes to help us build a gentle container for our time together. So to start, if you haven't already, I invite you to take just a few moments to orient yourself in this room. So just take a few moments to orient yourself to the exits. Take a few moments to orient yourself to your neighbor. Notice who is sitting near you, how close they're sitting near to you. Take a few moments to notice your breath and orient yourself to that part of the space too. If all this noticing is making you fidgety, notice that too. And that is okay. Really, the invitation during our time together today is simply to pay attention, and not just pay attention to what we are going to present up here, but also pay attention to what's going on in here. Or as my favorite Quaker author and activist Parker Palmer says, to also get your news from within. So the topic of childhood trauma is a tender one, and it's one that touches on realities both personal and collective. The data we're about to share with you today comes from our landmark Seminary to Early Ministry study, in which we're following over 500 Duke Divinity School students from matriculation into their first 5 years of post-grad ministry for the purpose of understanding the upstream factors that create for flourishing. So that create for things like feeling effective at work, or, struggling well amidst the intolerable, or just eating good food and exercising some and mostly sleeping through the night. But let me be clear, we're not clinicians. So we're researchers and research translators, which means this presentation is not meant to be a prescription. But it is meant to be a resource for you and for this community. And so to that end, you have resource handouts somewhere near where you are sitting. There are more on your way out. And there's also a human resource, a representative from CAPS, who is also available to talk to you on your way out. Finally, thank you to our co-sponsors of this event, the Office of Black Church Studies, the Hispanic House of Studies, and Divinity Pride, who helped shape our agenda for today. We're also really grateful for conversations with Dr. Fatima Saleh, Reverend Megan Benson, and Professor Jan Holton for doing likewise. So we have two main presenters today, David Eagle and Anna Holleman. Due to our limited time together, we're not going to close with a Q&A, but you are welcome to find one of us and ask follow-up questions afterwards. So a bit more about David and Anna. David Eagle is the principal investigator of the Religion and Social Change Lab. He has a background in both divinity and social science. He completed an MDiv at Fresno Pacific Seminary, a THM here at Duke Divinity School, and a Ph.D. in sociology. After graduating with his Ph.D., he worked for the Duke Clergy Health Initiative before striking out on his own to lead research into the impact of social change on religious leaders and those who support them. David spent 6 years as a senior pastor of Saanich Community Church in Victoria, British Columbia. Not a bad place to minister. Anna Holleman is a postdoctoral research associate working with the Religion and Social Change Lab. She got her MDiv from Duke Divinity in 2018 and graduated with her PhD in sociology from Duke in 2021. In her free time, she enjoys completing complicated Lego builds like the Challenger, Colosseum, and Eiffel Tower, which brings together her love of understanding the big picture and how it fits with all the 1,000 pieces. And now, without further ado, I'm going to welcome David to set the stage.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Aaron, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming. I'm not sure what drew you today besides the free lunch, but my hope in hosting this event is that we might open a larger conversation about the role of childhood adversity among those training for religious leadership. If you are here because of a difficult past, welcome. The goal of this workshop is to help you avoid some of the kinds of hardship that I myself experienced trying to work as a pastor with significant unresolved trauma in my own past. As Aaron said, I spent 6 years as senior pastor of Saanich Community Church on Vancouver Island. And I think most people, would probably say that I was a pretty good pastor. And I actually enjoyed most parts of my job, the preaching, visitation, even the administration and the dreaded budgeting. All those things felt rewarding and mostly manageable. But I also found my job overwhelming. And it wasn't because of the tasks that I was asked to perform. What I found overwhelming was the emotional and relational and interpersonal demands that pastoral ministry placed on me. Those were the things that I found difficult to manage. To understand why, you need to understand a bit of what drew me to pastoral ministry. Our stories, our call stories, are deeply implicated in why we come to ministry. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, as a pretty lonely and isolated child. My father had a serious mental illness. My mother, who had grown up in a poor immigrant family, had experienced alcoholism, her father's alcoholism and abuse, and she never really dealt with her traumatic upbringing. My parents were verbally, emotionally, and sometimes physically abusive towards one another. They separated when I was 12, and around the same time, my sister developed a serious personality disorder. My childhood and adolescenthood were both marked by chaos and instability. When I was 18, I found faith through a campus ministry group. And the story of Jesus' redemption had tremendous appeal to me. The story of redemption is powerful to someone who has had much of the innocence and joy of childhood stolen away from them. I also found a home church, something I had never experienced growing up. And through that church, I found connection, belonging, nurture, singing, and support. Many of the key ingredients in healing. And in many ways, I found a new family. And it was from that experience of finding healing through the community of the church that I decided to pursue pastoral ministry as a career. Brene Brown captures the essence of leadership pretty well when she says, "Who we are is how we lead." And who I was when I entered seminary at 25 was someone with a very difficult childhood, mostly unaware of how those negative experiences growing up had left their mark on me. For better or for worse, our families of origin and the circumstances in which we grow up define who we are. Humans have the longest childhood of certainly any living species today, but probably the longest childhood of any of our hominid ancestors. In most primates, brain circuitry is largely set by their first birthday. For humans, and I have experience of this with a 17-year-old in my house, that doesn't happen until they are 16 or 17. Now, these very long periods of childhood that we experience as human has a downside, has a lot of upsides. Our long childhood means that there's opportunity for adverse experiences to interfere with our healthy development, both neurologically and psychologically. Of particular importance during childhood is how we experience and attach to our primary caregivers. Children have the best opportunity to grow into thriving adults if they have primary caregivers who lovingly and consistently meet their needs. And when our relationships with the adults who care for us get significantly disrupted, we can struggle emotionally and relationally as adults. I think the best succinct definition of trauma that how childhood trauma impacts us is this. It's the struggle to feel comfortable in your own skin. This resonates. It's hard to feel at ease in my body and in my life. I feel both guarded and on guard. But neither at 25, when I entered seminary, nor at 28, when I started pastoral ministry, did I really have any solid understanding of this. But like many survivors of traumatic childhood, I'm adept at masking my interior struggles and not letting other people in. Few people knew that my relative success, first in seminary and then as a pastor, was punctuated by a huge amount of inner turmoil and struggle. If as children we reach out for support and it isn't there, or our caregivers don't respond consistently and lovingly, this can make exposing our vulnerabilities a scary proposition. Children exposed to significant adversity often see the world as a threatening place. And so finding joy, feeling a sense of belonging and peace can be elusive. The research is very clear. Adverse childhood experiences are linked to a whole pile of negative outcomes, particularly with mental health struggles. This resonates with my own experience, certainly. With an impaired capacity for joy and intimacy, with poor emotional regulation, and struggling with serious mental illness, it was difficult pastoring my congregation both effectively and sustainably. Ironically, it was the very thing that drew me to pastoral ministry, that I found hope and healing from a difficult childhood in the church. That was what drew me to ministry, but that was also the biggest obstacle that I experienced towards effectiveness in ministry. I start with this story, not to leave you without hope, or not to simply put my suffering on display, but I raise this story to leave you with some hope. As people, we are resilient. There's a mountain of research that also demonstrates that. There are tools to put the pieces of a fractured life back together. There are practices to help manage our difficult pasts, and healing is possible. But it takes awareness, it takes courage, and it takes resolve. And so again, welcome here, and I look forward to this conversation continuing here and after the session is over. The rest of our session is going to unfold this way. Anna's going to come and present some of the research that we've done on adverse childhood experiences among Duke Divinity School students. Some of you have contributed this data, and so thank you for that. We hope this research helps normalize the experience of adversity in childhood. It is very common, particularly among those called to religious leadership. And after that, I want to talk very briefly about some directions that healing can take. So Anna, please come.
Great, thanks, David. So I am, like David said, going to present some findings from our data on adverse childhood experiences and trauma among Divinity School students. Like David said, some of you have contributed to this data, which we certainly appreciate. But before I get into the results, I do want to pause and talk about the word trauma. Obviously, David covered some of this. I think it's probably worth taking perhaps another minute to reflect on this. The technical definition of trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. But as the word trauma has increasingly become part of casual conversation and social media discussions, trauma is often used as a catch-all term for any experience of distress, right? So everything becomes traumatic, which means that sometimes nothing is traumatic, right? So this has led to discussions around classifications of trauma. You may have heard things like capital T trauma versus lowercase t trauma, as if there were more or less valid experiences of trauma. At the same time, using the word trauma can validate the pain that a lot of people feel. So perhaps it doesn't matter if someone has experienced capital T or lowercase t trauma. It matters that they're feeling distress, and we think that's an experience worth honoring. I'd also like to mention that in recent years, there's been greater attention paid to society levels of trauma, such as the ways that racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia harm people deeply. And I think we as scholars now understand that trauma is not just a personal experience, but can also be a collective experience. It does not happen in a vacuum, but in systems of power and oppression. And so offering a talk with trauma in the title, we want to share first that we're aware that we're walking into a very large discussion that we're sure is probably ongoing in your lives, in your churches, in the Divinity School. And we want to be very careful about the types of trauma we are and are not talking about in this presentation. So the kind of trauma we'll be talking about today are adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. You guys probably heard David use this phrase. Some of you may be super familiar with this terminology. It may be new for others. I'm going to spend some time walking through it, especially for the folks who perhaps are new to this terminology, but also even people who are aware, just again to make sure we're on the same page. The ACEs scale is a validated scale, often used in research on health specifically, that refers to a specific set of potentially traumatic and stressful events that occurred during a person's childhood, so prior to age 18. The ACEs scale has 8 domains or experiences that are typically included. They're up on the screen now. I'm going to walk through them slowly again, just to make sure we're on the same page. So first, if you lived with someone who was experiencing mental illness. So either someone who was mentally ill or who was suicidal. This could be anyone in your household, a parent, a sibling, another relative. Second, if you lived with someone who abused substances, including alcohol, drugs, or prescription medication. If you lived with someone who was or had been incarcerated, if your parents were permanently separated or divorced, and if you witnessed interpersonal violence in your home. So if your parents or other adults ever slapped, kicked, punched, or beat each other up. So I'll pause here at this point. So this is at number 5, if you're tracking. These are all contextual experiences, right? So these are things in the environment around children, often in the home. Abuse or dysfunction that children may witness are things that signal the absence, perhaps, of important figures in a child's life. But you'll notice that these last 3 are direct experiences of abuse experienced by a child. So we have physical abuse. If a parent or adult in the home ever hit, beat, kicked, or physically hurt a child in any way, this would exclude spanking or more sort of mild forms of corporal punishment. Second, emotional abuse. If a parent or adult in the home ever swore at the child, insulted them, or put them down. And finally, sexual abuse if anyone had unwanted sexual contact with the child. So importantly, each of these things only had to happen once to qualify for inclusion to the ACEs scale. But taking the scale in full, you can examine the scale in multiple ways, sort of as researchers. You can look at each of these individually, analyzing each as sort of individual instances, or you can ask a person to say, have you experienced this, yes or no? Basically give each person a 1 for the things they have experienced and add them up. So you may have heard the term ACEs score. What's your ACEs score? There's some podcasts that talk about this a lot. And so that's the ACEs score. It's the 0 to 8. Before I move on, so this is just a little bit of a simplified version, I want to pause here for a moment and point out 2 things. So my guess would be that as I was going through these, perhaps you were seeing some of these experiences in your own history, or perhaps in the history of people you know well. Over 60% of adults in the U.S. have experienced at least one of these by age 18. So I share this scale to ground our presentation, while also I want to acknowledge that many of us perhaps were doing that tally in our head, perhaps. I also want to acknowledge what is not here. there are many things that certainly have the propensity to be experienced as traumatic that are not on this scale. So for example, we could think about experiencing the death of a family member, or experiencing eviction or police violence or natural disasters, right? You can make a long list of what is not included here. This list is not meant to be exhaustive. So why should we care about this specific list of adverse childhood experiences? So we're focusing here for a handful of reasons. So first, as David mentioned earlier, there is a huge amount of evidence that shows a strong correlation between experiences of adverse childhood experiences in childhood. Again, sorry, I'm saying the same words multiple times. This was developed by the CDC in the 90s, the scale to try to understand the impact of events during different life stages. And they've, again, found a hugely robust literature that shows that as the number of ACEs increases for an individual, the probability of experiencing mental illness, chronic disease, substance abuse, even early mortality increases. This is not determinative, it is not causal by any means, but we do see that risk factor increases substantially. So we know that for pastors and other faith leaders to be effective in ministry, they need to take care of their mental and physical health. And so thinking about these ACEs is especially important. However, research on ACEs has also gone much further than just thinking about health at this point. There's now a large literature on ACEs and career choice in adulthood, and this work suggests that people with a higher number of ACEs are more likely to select helping professions as their career, such as being a therapist, social worker, counselor, even police officer. And so with the explanation being that when individuals experience these kind of hardships in their childhood, they're more likely to select into a helping profession. This is in alignment with this idea of the wounded healer, right? Many of you are probably familiar with this, that someone who has experienced deep suffering personally often is able to draw meaning from those experiences to then help others who may be experiencing the same thing. And we argue, right, that pastors and faith leaders are a helping profession, a specific type of helping profession, and have many of the same job responsibilities as those in helping professions, and the similar processes may be at play. And finally, we think it's worth thinking about ACEs among divinity school students and future pastors because of the relationship between ACEs and ministerial formation and ministerial experiences. So we know that pastors have privileged access to people's most vulnerable moments, right? So pastors are the ones allowed into the hospital rooms. They're the ones that are called after experiences perhaps of interpersonal violence or divorce. Pastors are called on both to respond directly, but also to make sense of these events in the aftermath. And we know that while that can be extremely meaningful and helpful for the pastors to be there, that can also cause vicarious and secondary trauma for the pastors responding. Importantly, we know that these experiences of vicarious trauma and secondary trauma are especially impactful for the well-being of individuals who have a background of childhood trauma. It makes recovering and bouncing back from these experiences of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, more difficult. And so again, this is why we're trying to bring attention today to the ways that the conditions of the ministry profession can make it especially hard to healthily function and thrive when you have this background. So after all of that background information, we'll now get into what we know about students at Duke Divinity School. So you know a bit about our methods, like we've mentioned, Seminary to Early Ministry Studies. Some of you participated. Thank you again. Please continue to do so. In the data that I'll present today, we asked every incoming student, again, some of you may have done this, to fill out the ACEs questionnaire that I just showed you upon entering seminary. So first semester in seminary, it was part of a larger survey collection. Today, I'm going to pull together all the master's level students at Duke Divinity School that entered in the 4 entering cohorts, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. Again, some of you are probably in the room. Additionally, for a comparison group to best understand the prevalence of ACEs that we see among students here, I'm also going to pull in a nationally representative study collected by the CDC, which also collects data on the ACEs yearly. And we do some statistical techniques to match that CDC data to the demographics of our Duke Divinity School sample in order to best contextualize our findings. But I'll signal when we get there because there's a little bit more complicated statistics there. Okay, so getting to our results. So first, this is just going to be the Duke Divinity School students. So across the bottom axis here are the 8 domains, and this figure will show the prevalence among our seminary sample at Duke. Okay, so here are the prevalence of these adverse childhood experiences among Duke Div students. So I'll leave this up for a minute so you can take it in. But you can see that there are a few domains that certainly stand out, right? So we can see that over a third of students here lived in a household with a parent or adult experiencing mental illness. About a quarter lived in a household with a parent or adult struggling with substance abuse. You can also see that over half of Duke Div students over on the right experienced emotional abuse, and about 1 in 5 Duke Div students experienced physical abuse or sexual abuse in childhood. Further, if you'll remember that 6 in 10 Americans experienced at least one of these ACEs domains, in our sample about 7.3 out of 10 Duke Div students experienced at least one of these domains. And while obviously we certainly think these numbers are worth looking at on their own, focusing on their own, we also want to situate these numbers within the larger context, which is where I'll bring in the national sample data so we can understand how our sample among Duke Divinity students compares to the national population. So this is the comparison, the seminarians, so that's the Duke Div students are in gray. The US population, again, the demographically matched, nationally representative sample is in white. So what stands out to us specifically is that our sample of seminarians have significantly higher prevalence of growing up in a household with an individual experiencing mental illness, significantly higher rates of having direct experiences of emotional abuse, and significantly higher rates of experiencing sexual abuse in childhood compared to a similar demographically matched national sample. And an important thing to note is that in the research on ACEs and mental health later in life, that these 3 highlighted in the red, highlighted ACEs domains are especially predictive of higher risk for poor mental health later in life, more so than the other ACEs domains. So we think this is really important to think about in considering the well-being of seminarians and the well-being of future pastors and faith leaders. A quick methodological note that I'll mention briefly, I'm totally happy to talk about later, is that the sexual abuse item in the seminary survey was slightly more expansive. This is getting into the weeds of methods, but I think it's important to mention. Slightly more expansive than the CDC question. So we would expect our sample to have higher rates just because of the wording of the question, but I don't think this high of a difference at the, over twice as high. So I just want to, there's a little bit of caution interpreting those results. Again, happy to talk about that later if you're interested. So now turning to my second question for today, what subgroups of seminarians report higher rates of ACEs? So today we'll just look at differences based on gender, race, and ethnicity, and sexual and gender minority status. Notably, again, getting into the methodological weeds a little bit with race, because of our sample size, for statistical analysis, there's a somewhat large enough sample of Black students, certainly a large enough white sample, but there just really aren't enough students of other racial groups to break out into individual analyses. Statistically, again, happy to talk about this later, but that's why you'll see an other race category, just because of sample size. So first here is the difference between men and women students at Duke Div, women in the Black, men in the white. Importantly, we removed students who identified as non-binary from this analysis because there just weren't enough to have their own analysis statistically, though these students are included in all of the other analyses I showed, just not this one. But we see that among Duke Divinity School students, women are significantly more likely to have lived with someone in their childhood who is experiencing mental illness, and almost 3 times as likely to have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And I think it's especially striking that close to a third of women at Duke Div reported experiences of sexual abuse in childhood. We would expect this, I think, based on past research on ACEs and differences by gender in the general population, but it's certainly still striking. Shifting to look at the differences by race, we have white students in the black bars, Black students in the gray, and the other race category, again, I mentioned, that's very diverse and just sort of too bad that we don't have the sample size to look at that in more detail. But we do find that compared to white students, Black students, and students in the other race category are more likely to have witnessed interpersonal violence in their childhood, and Black students are less likely to say that they grew up in a household with mental illness. And these differences reflect differences we find in the larger population, but I think, again, worthy of pausing. The last variation I'll show is the variation among LGBTQ seminary students versus cisgendered heterosexual seminary students here. We see high rates of ACEs among these students, including high rates of household mental illness, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Again, we would expect this based on research among ACEs and LGBTQ individuals in the general population, with what we know about family rejection and stigmatization of LGBTQ individuals at the national level. But again, I think it's certainly still striking and worthy of pausing. Further, as about 1 in 5 of incoming Duke Div students identify as LGBTQ upon matriculation, we think this is especially important to pay attention to. And though these are only 3 subgroups of Duke Divinity School students, certainly we could have pulled out other variations to focus on. We pull these out because we know that historically, in a predominantly white institution, in a career track that has historically been dominated by straight men, that women, people of color, and sexual and gender minorities already face many barriers in their experiences in seminary here, as well as when they go seek opportunities in the ministry profession. So we think it's worth thinking about intersectionally about the ways these groups of individuals may need specific care and consideration as they journey through seminary and then pastoral ministry, not because they're inherently damaged or sort of beyond redemption in some sort of strange sense, but because they've been the recipients of systemic inequalities. In my closing, before I hand it back off to David, I want to stress that what we've presented today in no way should suggest that students with any number of ACEs or any experiences of trauma, that these experiences in no way should disqualify or dissuade anyone from having a successful ministry career or a successful experience in seminary. We know that experiences of trauma, though certainly difficult and often extremely painful, can also be sites of transformation and sources of strength to serve those needing light and hope in their lives. However, we do think that this research suggests that as a community of both students and staff and teachers, that these histories should be acknowledged and addressed in the training of future pastors and community leaders. So now I will hand it back to David.
Thank you, Anna, for that presentation. I just want to acknowledge the heaviness of this subject. And so now the hard part. How do we respond to this information? Now, of course, we're not going to be able to formulate a full response in the 10 minutes we have left together. But I want to at least put a few things on the table that you might find helpful. Again, I cannot understate how incredibly damaging ACEs can be to our bodies, to our minds, to our relationships, and to our communities. Again, there's a huge amount of evidence from around the world showing how the experience of both major stressful events as well as chronic stress during childhood can cause major disability and disease. In a sermon to begin Lent, Alma, who I think is here, says this: to be able to be fully present for others and accompany them in their healing journey, we need to be fully present for ourselves first and be aware of our own unhealed open wounds. Those are good words. And if you have unhealed open wounds from your childhood, I encourage you to seek help. And we have a list of people, there's a representative from Counseling and Psychological Services here, that you can turn to for help. a little about my own healing journey, and it is my own, but I offer it as potentially helpful for your own journey. My own healing journey has been complicated, it's been frustrating, it's been slow, and it's been filled with dead ends and roads not taken. And it's also a journey that is still very much in process. This is about healing. This is about a process. This is not about a cure. I also want to acknowledge that everyone's path to healing looks different. But I want to offer just a few key ingredients that researchers and I myself have found useful along the road to well-being. So, with the presenter view and the slide view, healing. Chronic hyperarousal is very likely one major way that traumatic and distressing experiences in childhood can get under our skin and cause mental and physical problems. Now, hyperarousal is just a fancy term that's used to describe an overreactive fight, freeze, or flight stress response that keeps the body and mind on high alert, even when there's no cause for alarm. Now, if you think about a time when you've been startled or experienced something frightening, like being in an accident, you've experienced your nervous system turning off your higher order thinking and allowing more primitive parts of your brain to take over. Again, ACEs have been shown to push people towards living chronically in that sort of state. Probably why people with higher ACEs scores have higher risks for metabolic diseases, stroke, heart disease, diabetes, and the like. And this means that for many of us who experience traumatic childhood, that we tend to respond more reactively in situations rather than reflectively. This is especially true when we're responding to stressful situations. We respond reactively rather than reflectively. And so how do we thwart these tendencies? Well, one way researchers are exploring is through mindfulness-based stress reduction. Of course, mindfulness, like trauma, has become one of these buzzwords. There's mindful everything these days. However, I think what's behind mindfulness, I think, is incredibly valuable. Mindfulness-based stress reduction has been around for a very long time. It was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn and others in the 1970s. And there's nothing magical about mindfulness and mindfulness practices. Mindfulness-based stress reduction simply asks us to meditate and simply observe our bodies, our thoughts, our feelings, without over-identifying or overreacting to them. A regular practice of mindfulness is meant to help create space, to help create a gap between a sensory experience and your reaction that enables a person to respond more reflectively in ways that are more in line with their values than as opposed to reactively. Does this work? Well, I think we have decent evidence that yes, it does. At the Duke Clergy Health Initiative, we recently conducted an experimental study of mindfulness-based stress reduction, a mindfulness-based stress reduction course that's offered by Duke Health and Wellbeing with pastors. And we found that people who participated in a mindfulness program and also practiced the skills that they learned there experienced physiological changes that allowed them to be more reflective rather than reactive. Now, of course, we were not testing this intervention specifically on people with elevated ACEs or with trauma histories, so our evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it fits with what other studies are finding about mindfulness-based practices. So one key ingredient of healing is learning how to get out of our heads, as many mindfulness coaches say, to take a breath, to pause, and to allow space for us to respond reactively. It's a retraining of our bodies to do this. So much of how we exist in the world develops during childhood. Not only do we learn actual language, we also learn a complex social language that profoundly influences how we think and behave. When our childhoods are marked by significant adversity, this predisposes us to developing negative thinking or distorted ways of thinking and behaving. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, probably something you've probably also heard out there in the self-help world, is a therapeutic approach that usually involves efforts to change patterns of thinking and behaviors that are distorted or causing problems in your life. Now, changing patterns of thinking and behaving is really hard work. The experimental evidence is not always super conclusive on how well these things do, because this is just such hard work. It takes time, it takes support, it takes regular and consistent practice. And there are a vast array of CBT and related sorts of therapies out there. But I think the evidence is pretty good that these things help. And the best place to start with these sorts of therapies is by talking to a therapist or a psychologist. So another ingredient to healing is challenging distorted ways of thinking and behaving. Now, because this presentation is here at the Divinity School, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the place of the church and theology and healing from adversity in childhood. In my own journey, I will say that Christian communities have played a complicated role. Those with trauma in their backgrounds have difficulty in their human relationships. They can also have difficulties in their spiritual relationships as well. Christian communities are not always attentive to the needs of people with trauma in their background. But let me at least make the case for the healing possibilities that can be found in the church and in community. Many people with significant adversity in their childhoods, particularly those who have survived abuse, struggle with a crippling sense of shame. Now, shame has been variously defined, but at its core, shame is about feeling inadequate. Shame is about feeling flawed, about feeling unworthy of love, acceptance, or belonging. Now, you're all divinity folks. You've all taken lots of Bible and theology. And I encourage you to think about the rich resources, the many rich resources in the Christian tradition, which can help unburden us from crippling experiences of shame. I think of liturgy, I think of music, food, of prayer, belonging, of human connection. These are all full and ripe with healing possibilities and potentials. And so I think these three ingredients, learning the skills to pause, challenging distorted ways of thinking and behaving, and leaning into our own faith traditions, while these don't exhaust the ingredients in a recipe for healing, they are, I think, essential elements. And I want to close with just a very quick word about psychiatric medications. Of course, these are also an essential ingredient for many people. But again, they are only an ingredient. Changing our body's chemistry through medication can, of course, make it easier to relax and be more reflective. They can help our minds more easily escape from negative patterns of thinking and behaving. They can help compensate for physiological deficiencies that adversity can cause. But if you spend any time studying adversity in childhood, you quickly come to recognize that humans are a complex interplay of our physiology, of our psychology, of our social relationships, and of our social circumstances. And becoming better or becoming more whole humans requires working all of these angles. There's a lot more to be said about this topic. We could spend another hour at least discussing this. But unfortunately, we're almost out of time. But I hope, again, this is the beginning of our conversation and not the end. So to that end, I'd like to invite Aaron to come and close our time together. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for spending your lunch hour with us. As I said earlier, if you have any questions, you're welcome to come up here afterwards and find David or Anna. You're also welcome to email me, and I will send it on to the right person if it's not a question I can answer. But in the meantime, I really hope you'll take note of the resources that are in front of you, the resources that exist on the other side of the door as you leave, and the resources that exist within you. Please be gentle with yourself as you transition from this space into wherever you are going next. And as a way to help you do that, I am going to bless you on your going. This is a blessing that comes from Dr. Thema Bryant, a Duke alum and AME elder. May you find ease within yourself. May your body be safe to relax, your mind be safe to flourish, and your spirit be safe to soar. May you reclaim your breath, voice, gifts, and fire. May you glory in the sound of your laughter and delight in the beauty of your dance. May you forgive, accept, and love yourself fully and courageously. May you recognize and remember yourself no matter what is happening around you. May you give yourself permission to always come home and find the welcome mat in place. May you connect with kindred spirits for mutual care along the way. May the sacredness of your being always take priority over the busyness of your doing. May you know deep down in your bones that you are lovable and worthy of respect. May the values of compassion and liberation guide your feet in purposeful living. May your soul perpetually tell your heart, mind, body, and spirit, welcome home. Let it be so, and so it is. Amen.